Hey there, ADHD Goals listeners. Before we get into today's episode, have you ever tried productivity tools that claim to be ADHD friendly, only to find that they're just like all the other neurotypical ones? Yep, me too. That's why I created something different. It's called the ADHD Canvas. It's a visual mapping tool that helps you make sense of how your unique ADHD brain works. And in a 90-minute one-on-one intensive session with me, we'll use it to figure out what's really going on behind your procrastination, overwhelm, or stop-start patterns. You'll finally have that aha. That's why I do that moment. So when you can see it clearly, you can finally understand how your unique ADHD brain works, and you'll have access to over 50 executive function coaching tools to help you build a rock-solid action plan that will help you reach your goals. Sessions are limited, but as listeners of the ADHD Goals Podcast, you get to jump the queue. So just tap the link in the show notes to book your 90-minute ADHD Canvas intensive session, and let's get you unstuck. Now, on with the show. Hello and welcome to another episode of the ADHD Goals Podcast. I have a wonderful guest for you today. Her name is Dr. Tamara Hussein, and she is a registered educational and child psychologist, and she's a practicing partner of neurokids.co.uk, and she supports and empowers children and young adults with developmental and educational and mental health needs. And I'm really looking forward to today's conversation because I do like it when we have a conversation about how we can apply strategies and neuroscience to helping children with ADHD. So I'm really looking forward to what we're going to chat about today. So welcome to the show, Dr. Tamara. How are you doing?
Thank you so much. Yeah, not bad. Thank you. Thank you so much for the invite. And it's great to be here, being able to speak about ADHD, discuss strategies. So thank you.
Oh, brilliant. Well, I'm really looking forward to it. So before we do get into all those wonderful neuroscience strategies, I wonder if you could tell the listeners a little bit about yourself and your background, how you got into doing what you're doing now.
Okay, brilliant. So I have, prior to becoming an educational psychologist, I was a practicing teacher, both abroad and here in the UK. So I've taught in Australia roughly between the ages of 5 to kind of 18. And same here, really, through various opportunities, voluntary work and things like that. So that's kind of given me a broad understanding of a range of learners, as well as those with diverse needs of different ages, because obviously age, as we find developmentally, is quite important in terms of, what their sort of interests and kind of presentations are at different ages and what that means for teaching strategies and learning. So that's that. And obviously, when I came here to the UK, I was at a bit of a crossroads in deciding whether to carry on with teacher training here and then, or, indeed sort of follow the pathway towards educational psychology. Psychology and education have always been my passion, sort of looking under the bonnet and really understanding how learners learn. Obviously, the teaching degree and qualifications gave me the opportunity to, explore that a little bit, but actually studying in detail how minds work for both neurotypical and neurodiverse children was greatly inspiring. So I, have been really pleased to carry on with that journey. So here in the UK, I have worked for several local authorities, producing what we term as educational healthcare plans for, young people with a range of complex needs. Although a very kind of structured piece of work, ultimately you do come across a range of learners, whether they have, ASD, ADHD. Even within those profiles, there's so much diversity. ADHD. Yeah, absolutely. So within ADHD, for example, you have, so many variations, and that inevitably has implications for interventions and strategies. So that was all eye-opening and continues to be eye-opening as I, develop in my career. Over time, I've been really interested in kind of brain-based work or neuroscience. So 12 years ago, neuroscience was just, becoming a little bit dominant in the discourse of EP. So I kind of explored views around it. and, started to see neurodiversity through the lens of the brain or the lens of neuroscience, which was quite, inspiring as well. So at the moment, we carry out various training programs with teachers, parents, practitioners, EPs, our educational psychologists, kind of trying to share that research and talk about the implications for practice, in the classroom, at home, out there within professional communities. And that is hugely empowering, I feel, for practitioners and parents, particularly because of the fact that, whether it's ADHD or ASD, parents and practitioners suddenly become aware of a physiological reality or a physiological basis of their child's needs. And that, interestingly enough, always becomes very far easier, I feel, to visualize and, understand. So, so at the moment, kind of that area really interests me.
Mm. I mean, you've already touched on a number of questions that I wanted to ask you. So I'm now trying to prioritize which one I ask you. I mean, lastly, you just mentioned like the parents and understanding how the brain works. I think from a parent's point of view, if they are neurotypical or they haven't had any experience of understanding ADHD or any other challenges, it can be really just a little bit of understanding and frameworks and around what is happening in the brain can be so crucial to helping try and understand how they can support them. And I think that any parent that has to realize that their child might have some distinct needs, before you get any of that information, you can feel very lost and not know how to deal with any of these things. So I think it's wonderful, that process of being able to provide parents with some knowledge so that they feel armed to tackle different situations.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
I wonder, you also mentioned earlier on just about the differences between ages, age brackets. And I wonder if you could explain a little bit more how that progression through the ages does affect what strategies you might use.
Yeah, absolutely. So the critical phases that we tend to focus on, in terms of the neuroscience training are the early years. So roughly between the periods of 0 to 5. And then again, of course, in adolescent period. It's not to say that the childhood period post 5 and before 12 is necessarily unimportant, but we see a general stagnancy, I guess, in the neurological profile. Whereas in between 0 to 5, for example, as you know, there's a lot of kind of synaptogenesis happening, connections between neurons, followed by the pruning process where their skills become far more fine-tuned as time goes on. So hopefully by the end of the 5-year period, and indeed the adolescent period, the brain of those two brackets become far more efficient in processing information, understanding. So it becomes therefore so much more critical about providing, parents, practitioners with that knowledge so that they could then really focus their time. It could be anything. And, I could be very broad in saying, in terms of work-related commitments, leisure commitments, the teaching processes and resources that are used, how do you kind of focus them or hone in on those key developmental periods? So, for example, in the early stages, we know that, visual skills, neurologically, developing at great speeds. So is gross motor skills. So not only in terms of ADHD can we start to, appreciate that, yes, they have that kind of profile of high levels of activity, high levels of impulsivity and energy that will obviously become evident as a child is growing in those periods. But what can we do to sort of complement that? To sort of provide stimulation, for example, and raise those dopamine levels and spikes. Is it about giving them, for example, one is a surprise element. Children love that surprise, visually stimulating, sparkly stuff, cellophane, sort of different types of kind of sensory objects and things like that, things with light and sound. So not only are you kind of thinking about the visual development, but you're also, providing resources in line with that developmental period. Gross motor skills are in development. So what can we do for ADHD young people between 0 to 5? We can try and, first of all, establish secure gross motor skills and coordination. And then in line with their ADHD, we might provide them with, sort of things like forest school activities, climbing equipment, soft foam equipment, and really trying to get them in a kind of mode of being able to manage their ADHD, impulsivity, hyperactivity off the cuff, as early as, their early years period. So that's kind of how to start off, I would imagine. And then obviously considering the adolescent period and the huge second wave of synaptogenesis leading to more kind of development in the prefrontal cortex, which also aligns with our understanding of ADHD. That tends to be the area that is affected in terms of planning, organization, inhibition, controlling behavior and emotions. How can we sort of balance that kind of need for risk taking and stimulation, but doing it in sort of safe ways that kind of fosters their need to be independent during the adolescent period, but also starts to manage their ADHD. So yeah, tending to sort of think about, I'm very much in training courses, really keen about narrowing down on the key areas of development, first of all, and also, describing the kind of key principles of neuroscience. So the brain changes as a result of direct experience would be one very potent sort of principle that we'll share. And that, indicates sort of experience, moment by moment. So whenever the parents and practitioners are doing things, that's having a direct effect on the choices and the behavior then the adolescent or the young person shows. So that's reciprocity between the adult and the young person is absolutely paramount in managing those needs.
Well, I was going to ask what's something that really interested me about supporting children with ADHD. Like, for example, you might give me a really good tip on how to manage a certain aspect of executive function or something. And then I could go away after this and think, right, I'm going to start implementing that in my daily routine or whatever. But the question is the challenge that comes with children and their, I suppose, lack of autonomy or an agency to be able to do some of those things. It means that they're really reliant on the support from their parent, but then also when they're at school, the support from teachers, and also the challenge of how do you get a child to, we were talking about giving parents the information of how the brain is working. How do you approach sort of helping the child understand what's going on inside their head? And then here's the tools to use, but it seems so challenging to get them into a way of being able to practice those things. How do you manage that?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. And, as psychologists, we have a range of tools. I mean, first of all, I think it's really important to highlight the fact that understanding neuroscience and, even how our training courses work, I start sort of sharing things such as introspection, metacognition, mindfulness practice. These are all in the spirit of, neuroscience, if you like, and that we become more aware of our biological mechanisms, our internal mechanisms. And, as far as possible, can we share these wonderful insights with young people? Well, because I find because of the highly visual, literal element, if you like, of how the brain works, you can, share these in very insightful ways through artwork, through animation, through role play. At the end of the day, one of the other key principles is the brain is actually behaving. How is it behaving? It is engaging in cause and effect. It is engaging in action and reaction. If you do something to it, it reacts in certain ways, very much like young people behave in the playground. So there's a stimulus response, and the brain is very much operating according to those patterns. And where you see those patterns, it becomes far more easier to represent that in various ways. Again, visual means, videos, animation, getting them to draw, doing artwork. In one of our training courses, we actually get adults actually to sort of draw the brain, onto these sort of polystyrene heads using a bit of a swimming cap. So they take it away as a souvenir. And also the day I was actually working with a young person who really was quite frustrated about their learning, a high functioning ASD type child. And they were quite keen about knowing why they weren't learning as efficiently as everyone else. So I kind of just drew a very simple neural circuit, composing simply dots and lines, and a very simple representation. But as long as it kind of sheds light on the principles, that's what I'm keen about. So, the child kind of understood, as a line sort of connected between dots that, learning was occurring, and effectively in a very sort of simplified way, that is how the brain is, operating. So, role play animation and drawing and art is a wonderful way. There are brilliant interventions that are out there, Healthy Minds being one of them, I think, that gained NHS approval recently. And, children, I feel it really resonates with them to kind of help them understand their biological processes. Suddenly, like, they see their bodies in very different ways. Like, oh, actually, my body is exerting influence on the environment. I'm choosing how my body reacts and takes action. The more you try to instill this understanding in young people in the spirit, as I was saying, mindfulness, introspection, the more that from a young age they'll get used to the idea, similar to interoception, talking about their senses in relation to the environment, talking about their physiology. I think more and more it's lovely to see that schools and parents are instilling or promoting this kind of understanding early on as these terms become far more circulated in, the community out there. So it's great, to be able to sort of share that. But first of all, obviously, it's important to educate and that parents and practitioners, and that's why, and that's very much, our objective at the moment, to kind of share that with staff out there.
You mentioned various sort of different ways of learning, and there was a lot of things like drawing and very kinetic learning and active learning and things like this. And I wonder, I don't know what the situation is when you were working in Australia compared to here in the UK, but I know in the UK there's a real lack of sort of Montessori education. And my children were very fortunate enough to go to a Montessori school for a lot longer than, because it did typically in the UK, it's Montessori nurseries. And because they know that they're going to start school the next year, they just it's just a blend. And so it's not really Montessori. But like I say, I was very fortunate. My children were able to access like true Montessori. And it fascinated me, and I thought it was fabulous. And I really wish that I'd had the opportunity to go to that. And more broadly, specifically in the UK, that it was more of an option. I mean, there's literally just a handful of schools that you can go from nursery to school leaving age. And I wonder what your thoughts are on that, and whether you would support like a movement to be able to bring in more options like this.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. And a lot of what's wonderful about Montessori and approaches like that is generally it can be cost-free. It's about experiential learning. It's about parents and adults providing, limited resources, but kind of resources that are very functional to that period of development. You can, I think in some of our training programs where we use things like, curtain rings, or we fill a bottle up with kind of beads or rice or pasta, and that can be, a maraca or something. You can sort of stack things and, basically learn some of those basic principles of play that develops cognitive skills in young people. I really do believe in, experiential kinesthetic learning. Again, most of these wonderful approaches, the wonderful thing about them, they're kind of in line with neuroscience and the way our brains work. And we don't need, necessarily a great amount of resources or overstimulation. I think there was a criticism towards kind of hot housing and, really kind of overstimulating children. It's about, providing those natural, resources to kind of stimulate them. And in different cultures like, Sweden, Switzerland, and Nordic countries, their kind of curriculum or formal learning starts far later. I'm sure you're aware, Lawrence, about some of those ways there. And it's very interesting. It's very much play-based.
They tend not to start until about 7 years old. Yeah.
Yeah.
No, well, I suppose there might be a lot of listeners in the UK that perhaps aren't really familiar with what Montessori is and why we're sort of talking about it quite passionately. But what I found is that child-led element of it. I mean, obviously it has all those fascinating elements of it being kinesthetic, and particularly like trying to learn maths when you physically see the quantities of things. It makes it a lot easier for someone who's very visual to understand what they're doing in maths rather than it being these abstract numbers on paper.
Absolutely.
But I think there's a fear with something like Montessori, which is quite child-led, that they just think, well, the child's just going to sit and play with something and not do and resist learning about the things that they're not interested in. And I think that was, until it was explained to me that what they're interested in can then be the mechanism by which the teacher, I know they don't call them teachers in Montessori, but they do say, well, once they've spot that their child is interested in something specific, they'll then sit down with them and say, well, how can we incorporate what your interests are with maybe that maths element that you're avoiding, and say, like, they're going outside to water some plants. They'll say, oh, do you know how we go to buy plants? We go to a shop and, talk about how you might run that shop and things like that. And once they've got that engagement, they're more open to learning about all the things that come with it. And I think it's fascinating.
I know, I do, very hands-on, very child-led. So it allows for that scaffolding and that exploration. And children love autonomy. Although we would think, they're a bit underdeveloped, we need to sort of give them structure. But I feel that absolutely you're right, that, society in our time can be overly structured, allowing the child to just explore. We're obviously very bogged down a lot of the time with routines and schedules and things like that, more so than perhaps we were about 50 years ago. So, it's just the signs of the times. But, what I quite like is stripping all that back and being able to come back to the core of the child or the core of the person. Again, working with biology to know, what is right at this time, what is developmentally and neurologically appropriate. Absolutely.
I mean, I think there's a more and more conversation these days about PDA. And I think thinking about a child that might have PDA and putting them into a classroom where they've got you got 60 minutes to sit still and learn this. And then it's, boom, we're going to go to the next thing. And it's like, oh, wow, how much must be going on for them in terms of being told exactly what to do when really they've probably got a physical need to do this.
Yeah, that's interesting. I'd had 2 recent cases of PDA, and teachers obviously kind of calls an EP in. Really, we've tried various strategies, going with their interest, going with their motivation, but the output would be extremely low, and any sense of demand and whatever. And I remember watching this kind of, educational reel of a person with PDA actually describing their experience. And it was very visual, very symbolic. They were standing at the sink with, a pair of gloves about to do the washing. And then an adult walks in and it's like, oh, just to remind you, can you just get the washing done? Took off the gloves and just threw them. And they describe the experience very much like, oh, as soon as they said that, my brain said no. So it's not necessarily them. And that's how I kind of envisage this kind of change in agency, and that talking about the brain to other people is quite empowering because it allows agency. It's kind of saying that, look, I have, an entity in here and, I'm being told not to do this, not to kind of respond to what you're saying, but I'm just this way. So, with teachers and practitioners, how do you bypass that and maybe use language strategically in a way that kind of would invite that, or give options that doesn't place that demand on the young person?
I mean, certainly, the way I rationalize my understanding of PDA, and this might not be a correct way of thinking about it, but I think it must be very related to that element of trust. And I think the person with PDA wants to feel trusted. And as soon as you place a demand on them, that they might think, well, I was going to do that anyway, but now that you don't trust me, I'm going to skip switches to the fast brain and it's just wants to get out of there. But no,
Definitely.
I think, and this, I suppose this is the scary thing for teachers, parents, and the whole education structure is it takes time to build up, for the child to build up that trust, or you to build up the trust in the child that they will do it. And I think there's far too much emphasis on results and feedback to know that everybody's working correctly, that you don't really get a true sense of the importance of that qualitative nature of what the child feels about how engaged they are with the education. If they feel trusted and engaged and have some agency, and that they're going to enjoy the experience of learning and more likely to invest in it on a longer period of time, when it all sinks in, rather than say, I hate this experience, I don't want to go there, and that's it. And then you just feel ostracized from the whole system for the rest of your life.
Absolutely, absolutely. And a bulk of the work is so much, isn't it, about kind of creating those learning environments that are stimulating, engaging. Obviously, the teacher's work is always challenging, bless them. It's kind of, within that structure, it might come down to the bare bones. As a teacher and instructor, am I enjoying the experience? What is it about me that, could be a little bit more stimulating itself? Is it my intonation, my tone of voice, the fact that I quite like the idea of making this experience fun for the young child, whether we're talking about the planets or underwater, can I make it, something that I intrinsically am fascinated about? And that kind of energy then translates into the classroom, and children sort of feeling far more sort of tuned in and engaged and kind of at one, I guess, with the teacher. So obviously, as I said previously, there are sort of stimulating, resources now available. Forest School, we've got, some schools with brilliant sensory spaces. More and more teachers are allowing, tactile objects into the classroom, but other teachers, interestingly enough, we still are very reluctant to have any other resources, for young people with neurodiversity. So it's kind of communicating and, bringing, staff to a common understanding of, what is stimulating to the mind developmentally. So if everybody had a uniform idea, there'd be less of that sort of conflictual, thoughts about, oh, well, that school might do it this way, I do it. So if we had a kind of baseline understanding, and then from that point, we're able as schools to be individually creative, about the approaches that we use, I think that's a nice balance to have.
Yeah, I mean, it certainly sounds exciting, but I do also realize that being able to put that into place is also very resource heavy and requires a lot of understanding on the teachers and support staff in terms of, like we sort of have been saying, understanding how the brain works really then influences how you sort of help teach. And I suppose understanding the behavior of an individual child, understanding what is happening in the brain so that you can react to that appropriately rather than just be like, oh, you're being naughty or what have you.
Absolutely. And you can pick your battles. That's the thing. We've had just a recent, very quick example of a teacher, instructing a year 9 DT class. And it was a very small class of about 4 or 5 children. And, the TT teacher, took issue with a child having headphones and obviously they were carrying on with their DT tasks, but obviously having the headphones listening to music. So I recall how this kind of exchange between the teacher and the student becoming quite heated, and and you just think, well, generally, if he's listening to sort of music, we know, for example, that may increase his sense of, feel good, his sense of his dopamine levels, and that could actually influence his engagement with the task at hand, rather than sort of be like an adverse effect. So it's, that exchange went on for a while, but if the teacher were educated that, music itself, kind of having those headphones on, it's not really interfering with that modality of learning necessarily. It's actually probably benefiting the young person and helping them stay engaged with that task. Again, a lot of these issues I feel can get back a little bit with that knowledge and understanding. So we're very keen. I think one of our packages is secondary school teachers. We have a package where we sort of share an understanding about the adolescent brain. So we talk about that whole period and highlighting things to do with risk-taking behavior. There's sort of striving for independence, also looking at sleep regulation difficulties, changing in prefrontal cortex, rejecting, authority requests and demands. So it's kind of like all these behaviors and choices are have a neurological basis. So shedding light on that suddenly kind of disarms, in a way, teachers, because it's like, oh, it's not about me anymore. It's not about that, that young person doesn't necessarily like me or my method of teaching. They're just going through this phase. And that kind of outlook in itself is transformative in the classroom, because then the teacher can go in and say, oh, look, I'm about to enter a classroom with these young people who obviously, are going through this, huge period of change and flux biologically. And, it's not necessarily about me. Let's just give them the best experience, build that trust, as you were saying, because trust is so important in, look, I'm going to allow you to be who you are at the stage that you're in. And, I have your best interests at heart. And, I'm going to teach this lesson as stimulating as I can. And, I won't respond to necessarily, I will sort of pick and choose with regard to, the behaviors that may be kind of low level as opposed to those that are really testing boundaries. So it's kind of allows teachers to make those critical decision-making choices.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
I wonder if I'm thinking about the listeners and them having some sort of really practical takeaways to have from this conversation. And I wonder if you have any specific favorite practical applications of any neuroscience nuggets that you like to share with relation to.
Yeah. So we know, for example, that, the sort of critical area that is affected neurologically is the frontal lobe. We know that, this area of the brain was final to develop in the evolutionary phase in people. So, this area is typically under complete change and flux between the ages of roughly 13 to 25 and doesn't really take its true form until 25 years. So what we mean by that is we know the brain has cells, it has neurons, and those kind of associated with different areas, learning, memory, attention. And what critically happens during these sensitive periods. Earlier I was talking about 0 to 5, and indeed the adolescent phase is that growth of connections between brain cells formed by or following that a period of pruning or fine-tuning the skills in adolescence. So we find that the prefrontal cortex is kind of a central figure. It's kind of like the executive area of the brain, the kind of conductor, if you like, which kind of, regulates things like attention, impulsivity, inhibition, memory, focus. And so this area is kind of developing at that period, which means that, while huge growth in connections are taking place, adolescents are kind of exhibiting certain behaviors that would help to fine tune it and actually lead to effective functioning as an adult. So risk taking, we find a lot of parents out there and practitioners will agree, risk taking is high on the agenda. So prior to that, if you think about the childhood period, children are generally formally kind of sort of, complying with adult instructions, very compliant. Primary school is a phase where they don't question authority. And suddenly in the adolescent period, they're questioning authority and, sort of challenging, coming to their own conclusions about things. So that kind of, if you like, symbolizes those, huge connections being made. So in that time, there will be a lot of mistakes and things, and it's how we respond to those, mistakes and choices, rather necessarily to punitive outcomes. We vouch for kind of positive outcomes or, reinforcing outcomes. So we might use our language and communication in certain ways to kind of foster, number one, that independence, but number two, that kind of advice of, that cautionary advice. Oh, I like your choice, but I wouldn't, what about doing it this way? It's kind of giving them a choice and starting to assume a kind of adult-like form of communication with them. And we find that adolescents generally like that kind of approach. They're kind of very receptive to that rather than giving them directives and commands, which is no longer desirable. So on the one hand, those types of things. So risk-taking behavior, again, taking safe risks, they will, as an outcome of their brain development, seek out, depending on their sort of upbringing, they might want to challenge boundaries a little bit more. So I find children who have lived in kind of adverse, had adverse life experiences or very unsettled home environment, they will tend to relatively challenge the boundaries a little bit more than, say, someone who's had a very settled environment. So again, it's about sort of, having more family time, having more connections. Parents tend to get busy during that period. So it's about, setting aside time, I guess, among parents of giving them, quality family time, even going on holidays and things like that can be sort of seen as highly stimulating. You need to plan, you need to organize, you need to get to the ticket desk, make sure you're there on time. So things that kind of incite that adrenaline. Sports is another one, sports and recreation, allowing them, lots of opportunities to release that kind of levels of energy. And we know that dopamine is quite, sporadic in that time, particularly with young people with ADHD. So, for example, I'd be happy, like my dopamine levels are heightened by a cup of coffee or finding the right pen, for example. Whereas, with adolescents, particularly with ADHD, they will need greater, different types of stimulation to increase those spikes, on a daily basis. So, thinking about the structures and routines in the day and ensuring that there are good periods of time where they get to release that energy either through outdoor activities, sports, trampolining, swimming, just going out with friends. So a range of these types of things. So those would be the kind of main ones specifically about ADHD. Again, it is about sort of, instilling those, safe boundaries at home and, creating that independence. So let me know if some of these are kind of in tune with some of your audience and what you have covered previously.
Well, what I've taken away from that was, first of all, the way that we as parents choose to respond to actions or behaviors or whatever, I think is very important. You were saying, I like your choice, but maybe I would have done this, that, the other. It's sort of, again, it goes back to that trust element of saying, well, I see what you've done and I probably understand why you've done that. However, and I wonder if you've got, but saying that, whilst we're having a chat about it here, it's really easy to say that. But in the moment where you personally, as the adult, might be slightly triggered by what has happened, or, it can be very then difficult to be the adult in the room when. So I wonder if you have any recommended stock phrases that just use a gentler language to acknowledge that they've made an independent decision, but without saying, no, don't do it like that.
Yeah, absolutely. No, I mean, I can't stress the importance of these devices being established in the childhood period.
Yeah.
That communication style, it's not like, you'd kind of start to suddenly introduce your communication style in adolescence necessarily, but towards, mid-childhood to later childhood, you'd start to kind of bring these, negotiation type language and tools at that point as well. So first of all, sort of having that trust between parent and young person at home, building that, sort of knowing that they're going to go through this transition stage, being mentally prepared as a parent, because that's so important to be mentally prepared for that complete change and transition into adolescence. And then obviously, when they do test the boundaries, think about things like humor. And I know that it's really hard to have humor, but if you've got a stock pot of phrases that a little bit on the sarcastic side, I think it works well with adolescents. Oh, it didn't work well this time, did it? You've come home a little bit more muddy than, I would have liked, or these kinds of rhetorical questions, for example, sort of highlighting the fact that they've made a choice. It wasn't greatly desirable, the outcome, but ultimately it was their choice. Well, it's kind of, even asking them, what would you do differently next time? But I feel that, number one, the trust needs to be established a lot more during the late phases of childhood.
Well, there might be some parents listening and go, well, I haven't done that. And they're now reaching, 13.
Yeah.
And wow, but that's it. Failed. But I suppose the important thing to consider might be that it's never too late to engage in that.
Absolutely.
But maybe trying to introduce those in a moment where it's all kicking off, perhaps it isn't the best time. Would you recommend sort of talking about this when I want to use the terms that I borrow the terms from the chimp paradox in terms of the human brain, which is the executive functions, and the chimp being the fight, flight, and freeze. And so what I tend to do is you've got to establish this understanding when you're talking to the human brain, when the child is relaxed and feeling logical. when the chimp is active and you start saying, right, we're going to implement this, they're not going to listen or understand.
Of course, yes.
But what I find, particularly with young people, is talking, like being able to visualize like that metaphor of the human brain and the chimp makes it easier to understand what the associated behaviors are with that. And then they can analyze their behavior or their actions based on who was in charge at the time. Was it the human brain or the chimp brain? And they go, okay.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. Absolutely. So you're absolutely right. So I think being able to sort of explain these processes, if possible, when they're in a state of calm. So if they have a space, and as some of your podcasts, I think, Lawrence, you're talking about quiet spaces and, a place where they can de-escalate from those heightened emotions. So having those spaces to retreat to when they've engaged in something, overstimulating or overpowering or some kind of aggressive response, they can retreat to these spaces. And then obviously when their brain is in a state of calm and, their sort of processes are working calmly, you can have those conversations with the young person. I noticed today, you have found something challenging and you responded in this way. And we can go into sort of details about the chimp brain or kind of the amygdala or emotional responses being quite sort of heightened. And we talk about sort of, I personally talk about, when I talk about emotions, I kind of show participants, pictures of clouds. I don't know, there's lovely sort of 3DX images of sort of clouds, and they kind of start sort of precipitating and there's various colors. And, that could sort of symbolize the overpowering or overpowered brain that kind of starts to kind of smother the rest of, the executive functioning skills so that choices can't be made, effective decisions can't be made during that period. So again, those might really work. But again, your sort of examples of, the chimp brain, I don't know if you've tried that with young people to kind of explain the challenge between obviously the kind of emotional brain and their executive functioning brain.
Yeah, I mean, tried to I made a video with my kids about it so that I had one of them.
Oh, wow.
I had one of them with a chimp mask on and the other one with like a lab coat on and sunglasses. But I mean, I tried to use another analogy, but unfortunately kids don't get the reference. I sometimes think, you've got two co-pilots in your brain. One is Sherlock Holmes and the other is Inspector Clouseau. But they can't, they don't know what the Inspector Clouseau is from the Pink Panthers anymore.
Yeah, that's it. A bit outdated, yeah, absolutely. So anything that could sort of indicate that overpowering nature, like I say, I create those clouds and this smog that kind of overpowers, and you can easily draw an image of a head where you've got sort of very distinct areas and processes, much like a road map. And then the road gets clouded by this smog that then sort of starts to look like it's overpowering that environment. And that's literally, how, we can sort of start to envisage our submissiveness, to, heightened emotions when we are in a state of dysregulation. So anything that illustrates that sense of overpowering, might illustrate that.
And you also mentioned, that family time and connectedness. I suppose what that left me thinking is again, we were sort of talking about like safety. When I always think about the chimp, maybe sort of, if it doesn't feel safe, then it's going to react with fight, flight, or freeze. It's going to be blocking out all the logical executive functions. So I suppose fostering that safe environment and also a safe environment to make mistakes in without judgment is really important so that chimp doesn't feel at risk and then override all the time.
Yeah. And I think that's a really good point, because I think as parents, it's always good to model or be in a state of cool calm as much as you can, because that modeling is what they then internalize. So despite them, adolescents kind of being in this kind of state where they're risk taking, going out there, challenging boundaries and things like that, what we tend to forget as parents or underrate is the fact that they're still seeking boundaries. Adolescents are not fully developed. They have a child within them that still seeks those boundaries, and they do expect parents to, offer those boundaries, because they almost know that, oh, look, I'm about to do this, mum's not going to be very happy. They're very clued on about that. They're very clear about that, I feel. It's just that they are kind of being instructed by the biological system. No, just challenge that today. And that's as a kind of very evolutionary way of thinking, most species kind of do that in order to develop. I mean, you wouldn't develop half the skills you have without risk-taking and mistakes. So it's very much like once you make that mistake, you're not likely to make it again. You're kind of stung by it. So if you hadn't have made it, then it's likely that in a future time you might make it again. So it's very much part of the developmental process, both for young people and for adults, but very crucially in young people. So you almost have to allow them sometimes, room for those safe mistakes. What I also find empowering is parents being able to share their mistakes when they were younger, but doing so in a very kind of narrative storytelling kind of way. Oh, I remember when and I went to that disco and I dropped all this coffee all over and I got laughed at and I just felt so humiliated and I went home and I had to change. These kinds of wonderful stories, they might kind of smirk or roll their eyes, but actually they're listening and processing, and they're very much looking for guidance. So sometimes when my young person, at the age of 16, when they share things with me, it's almost like they need that outlet to speak. And at that point, it's a critical point where you either respond in a kind of belittling way, or you kind of listen. You might even choose to be quiet. So sometimes, young people, they retort back and like, is it worth replying to that retort? Or should you just, quieten down and let them hear their own thoughts? That's often something we tend to underestimate. They are in the process of kind of listening to their own thought processes and being very aware that led to a mistake, but very likely to do with one of three reasons. So it's the adult having trust that the young person is very aware of, some of the mistakes and drawbacks that, they go through in day-to-day life, and allowing them as much time to kind of recalibrate and, kind of listening to their thoughts and problem solve and overcome. And then, offering, those kind of caring tips, as long as it's coming from a place of, authenticity, if you like. And that's something I also talk about in a lot of the training, about that sort of frequency of authenticity. Adolescents more than anyone else pick it up. That kind of frequency of, okay, is this person being genuine? Is this adult being genuine with their mistake, shortcoming in what they're telling me? So, if, parents and practitioners, if they continuously reflect on authenticity of what they're saying and aligning with what they're doing, that goes a long way. And that we do that ourselves as practitioners. We're always constantly reflecting on, are these approaches, interventions effective for the young person? Should I have done it a little bit differently? So you can go into sort of that self-narrative, even with the adult being present, like, oh, I don't know if I did that correctly. I mean, I should have done it this way. Anyway, I think I've learned from that and I'll do it well next time. So that kind of narrative can be hugely beneficial for both sort of mainstream adolescents as well as those with ADHD.
Yeah, because I think, well, I mean, my eldest is just about to reach this stage, so I'm sort of very acutely aware of all this now. But I think, as you were sort of saying, when, a younger child sort of puts a parent on a pedestal of like, they're always, look up to them and think they're always right. But then they reach that independence and then they think, well, they can't possibly understand because everything I've learned, I've arrived at my own thoughts. And it's impossible for a child to consider that you may have been young once and lived through all those experiences. And so I think what you were saying about mistakes that you've made, they start to see, oh, okay, they are fallible, but they're learning. And I think, I mean, my eldest is very resistant to making mistakes. And I think this is quite strain. It has a great strain on her. It's very difficult for her to own up to any mistakes or, admit that she might have not done something well. And I think that can be a big barrier. And I want to try and help foster the ability to understand that making mistakes is a faster way of learning.
Yes.
And it doesn't change my opinion of her and her friend's opinion of her and this, that, and the other. because I think you're resistant to that. I mean, I'm very similar in, I think you hold too much value on whether you've done something perfectly
Yeah.
or not. And that can be really stunting later on in life. So yeah, I think it's really important to sort of just, again, going back to the safety of it's safe to make mistakes and learn, continually learn. Like you were saying, the practitioners sort of always assessing, did I do that? Could I do that better? Because it's a lot more freeing, I think.
It is very freeing. And like you say, it creates a quicker pathway to learning. Imagine smaller mistakes on a daily basis rather than kind of that almighty mistake at the end of 4 or 5 years of trying the same thing. So, but yeah, so we're totally in reflection while we are parents and practitioners. So that's what's important.
Well, thank you so much for your time today. I know we're coming up to the end of our conversation now, and I just wanted to say if any listeners wanted to learn a bit more about you or maybe check out what services you provide, would you quickly just tell the listeners where they can reach you? I know you mentioned before neurokids.co.uk, but there was also, they can reach you directly as well.
Okay, so I have a private practice called EP Practice. So that's E for Edward, P for Penelope Practice, and Milton Keynes. We are also going to open offices in Melbourne in August 5th. So, we'll be based in Melbourne as well. So if you would like to, look at the website, there's opportunities to kind of come, with queries and questions. We welcome that daily. So we kind of know, what parents' needs are out there and how we could tailor services and training towards that. We offer online training courses as well as kind of face-to-face for teachers, practitioners, professionals working with young people of all ages. So do look out for that. EP Practice, Milton Keynes, soon to be at Melbourne on a Google search.
And just so that I understand, is it limited to the local area in terms of if you're in Milton Keynes, or can you access it online? And do you have to? Yeah.
Yeah. So yeah, international kind of, our website is accessible to all, no matter where you are on the globe. So, feel free to sort of reach out. We'd like to be there for as many parents, practitioners, professionals as possible. This area is becoming far more prominent as we speak. But what is lacking, I think, as you say, Lawrence, is the narrative, really making science relevant to practical applications. So that's what we're keen on, to kind of disseminate the science, share it in a very usable, kind of reader-friendly format through all those approaches, videos, animation, and things like that. That's what our training focuses on, but directly linking to then what does that mean for the strategies I apply as a practitioner and I can share with young people.
Mm-hmm. Fabulous. Well, thank you so much, Tamara, for a wonderful conversation. And I look forward to seeing what comes from you next. And
okay.
All right.
Lovely. Lovely to be here, Lawrence. Thank you so much.
Well, there we have it. Thank you so much for listening this far. If you want to hear more episodes, then please subscribe on YouTube or whatever podcast platform you use. It really helps to spread the word. So if you know anyone this episode could help, then please share it with your friends. If you want to follow me on social media, I am on Instagram at ADHD_goals, and you can find me on Facebook too. If you want to get in touch with the show, then you can email me at hello@adhdgoals.co. And finally, if you're struggling to manage your ADHD and you would like me to be your coach, then please head over to my website and get in touch. Until next time, bye for now.